Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The fight over redistricting is still unfolding, but its potential to reshape Congress and the way Washington works is already raising alarms. If the current trajectory continues, it could sideline moderates, deepen partisan divides, and make compromise on federal spending even more elusive. That could have serious implications for federal workers, especially as collective bargaining faces new threats and the possibility of a government shutdown looms. I'll unpack the stakes with WTOP Capitol Hill correspondent Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.
When Congress left town in August, the news cycles used to slow down a little bit. That's not happening right now.
No, it is not.
Top of everybody's headline list is redistricting, and I know you've been covering this. Tell us what's going on.
Well, really right now, redistricting is exploding. And normally this would be something that, political wonks would be looking at every 10 years. But now that we have an effort to redistrict in the middle of the cycle, literally right before next year's midterm elections, it's having a massive impact. And of course, ground zero has been Texas, where they're trying to add 5 seats. The governor has even threatened to do more seats, depending on how this standoff with the Democrats go there. And then it is just going from state to state. Every state is now looking at this in one way or another. Really, it ultimately could come down to about 12 states could actually do something right before the midterm elections. And of course, with only 3 seats in the balance here, it could go either way, just depending on what happens. And one of the latest, of course, to weigh in is California, where the Democratic governor Gavin Newsom has said, well, if they're going to do this in Texas, then we'll take 5 states here in California. So it's a tit for tat. Every state is looking at it now. Even Maryland, which has all but one member of Congress as our Democrats. Even Maryland is considering maybe looking at this first district seat of Andy Harris, who's the head of the House Freedom Caucus, trying to redistrict him out of that. We'll have to see what happens there. But overall, the view is that when does this end? People are really wondering how this is all going to play out.
It really does seem like it's not only picking up speed, but picking up sort of virulence. I mean, we're already talking about how hard it is to make compromises to advance any kind of legislative agenda. What would this mean for how Congress works or doesn't work if it goes forward?
Well, a lot of political experts say this is really very dangerous from both ends. And here's one example. You have a very shrinking small number of people that are in the middle in Congress right now. You used to have a fair amount of conservative Democrats and a fair amount of moderate Republicans. There are still a few of them left in various blue and red states. But if this continues in this direction, a lot of political scientists have said basically that you would have no middle then. And so both parties would be operating on the fringes. And of course, as you alluded to, the idea of bipartisanship in that environment is almost impossible. And we've already seen how hard it is right now within Congress, as you've seen rescissions with the White House and clawing back some of the federal money that's already been approved by members of both parties. That is going to become much more difficult as you get through the appropriations process, because there are fewer and fewer committees in Congress where there is actual bipartisanship. You can look to the Senate Appropriations Committee is a good example of one where they do still cooperate. Others like the Senate Intelligence Committee, but others are very, very, very much divided.
And does the decision on redistricting really just reside with the governors of the states?
It gets really complicated. In some cases, it can be unilaterally done, as in Texas, where the governor says this is the proposal and the state legislature moves it through. In many other states, however, Democrats over the years tried to set up independent panels. And those right now are, frankly, an obstacle for Democrats trying to move quickly, because the whole idea was to take the politics out of redistricting, which, of course, you can never do, as we've seen these crazy maps with the gerrymandering that look, something that looks like a salamander or a snake going through a state as they try to pick off as many Republicans or as many Democrats, depending on the party, that they can. So it is going to be a real mess over the next few months.
So what are members hearing out in their districts right now?
Well, some of them, it's interesting. So going back to those moderate members, some of them have said, when I go to my district, these people voted for me because they knew what the district was. And so there is some pushback from some more moderate Republicans in New York State, for example, Republicans in California. There's actually a proposal that would just stop all of this redistricting and say that it can't be done. But of course, with the president supporting this, that's not going to get through the House. So a lot of the people are trying to feel out where the people in their own districts, what they feel about this. And there is some unease about it because, let's face it, you go and you elect your member, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, and you know that that's going to be set at least for usually for about a 10-year period. And then the census changes, and that's a whole nother issue with the president making the push to change the census. That will be a much more difficult to do because it literally is something that's in the Constitution. The way they want to make those changes would have to go through the courts, and that's a whole nother ballgame.
I'm speaking with WTOP's Capitol Hill correspondent, Mitchell Miller. Well, Mitchell, when they do come back from recess in the beginning of September, the analogies that come to my mind are salting the earth or poisoning the well. How in the world are they ever going to get compromise on the budget bills that will face them when they come back?
Right. That is a huge question, isn't it? And they did have a little bit of bipartisanship before the Senate left. They got a few appropriations bills through the Senate, with Senate Majority Leader John Thune saying he wants to move back to regular order, essentially taking proposals that go through the Senate committee process, through that appropriations committee, and then getting them on the floor and then voting. But the House has only approved 2 appropriations bills. So you can see with just looking at the calendar, there's just not enough time to get all of those bills passed. So what I think you're going to see is yet another shutdown showdown where there's going to be a lot of positioning when the lawmakers get back, and then they're going to have to sit down and say, okay, what is this continuing resolution? What is the stopgap measure going to look like? And I think the real big question is, what are Democrats going to do? What have they heard when they went back to their districts? Do their constituents want them to really dig in and fight? Or are they worried that if there is a shutdown, that President Trump will take it farther and say, well, okay, the Democrats, they wanted to shut down. Now I'm going to cut even more federal jobs. So there is a lot at stake, of course, for federal workers as we get into this.
Well, we're hearing that while the members are back in their districts, even Republicans are getting some feedback that's not so positive about the reconciliation bill provisions. Do you think as we get to shutdown, showdown, and 2026 appropriations, they might try to revisit some of those provisions?
I think they will try to, but the problem for the House Republicans, and it sort of goes back to the redistricting, is that majority is so fragile in the House that they don't want to basically reopen things, because if they do, then various members will add new amendments. They'll say, well, let's take this out, let's add this. But I do think you're right. There is an appetite among some Republicans to say, wait a second, this is not settling very well with some of my constituents. We've seen, just as one example, in Missouri, Senator Josh Hawley, the Republican, has said he wants to move back on some of the Medicaid cuts. And so there is going to be an interesting political dance once again, with Democrats trying to make sure that they're not angering their constituents who they've been back visiting at that point over a period of several weeks, and then moving right into the appropriations process.
Well, just to change the subject a little bit, there is still committee work going on while all the members are out of town. What's moving forward in that space?
Well, a lot of people don't really realize, but during the recess, the committee staffs primarily do a lot of work. They're going to be doing a lot of the background work on what kind of scenarios they can play out for this continuing resolution. And then you have different things where it gets a little bit political again. You have the House Oversight Committee has been looking at the whole Jeffrey Epstein case. They've been rolling out subpoenas. There has actually been committee work where the House Oversight Committee has heard testimony in connection with looking at former President Biden's mental state. That's something that the Republicans have been doing. And then on the Democratic side, Virginia Congressman Bobby Scott, the ranking Democrat on the House Education and Workforce Committee, he has been concerned about those cuts at Health and Human Services. And he's written a letter to the HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., trying to get more information about these major layoffs at HHS. As you well know, and our listeners know, thousands thousands of people have been laid off within Health and Human Services. And he and many Democrats feel that the administration really hasn't explained how that is impacting the agency. What is actually taking place there? You don't just lose close to a quarter of your employees through layoffs, RIFs, separation incentives, and then have everything just stay status quo. So a lot of activity, percolating behind the scenes on Capitol Hill, even though we don't necessarily see it. We'll be seeing a lot more of the lawmakers, of course, out in their districts over the next few weeks before they get back in September.
So we wind up where we started. No shortage of news, even in August.
Yeah, remember it used to be basically people would take a vacation, a little bit of a nap in August, and now August is just ripping right along.
I've been speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks for joining me.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former senior advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites in airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. it's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank, in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.